Hello and welcome to The Last Word on Spurs. Thank you so much for joining us. As always, if you're listening to us for the first time, you can find us on iTunes, on Spotify, or across all major audio platforms. We're, of course, on Twitter at Last Word on Spurs. We're on Facebook and Instagram too. Joining me back on the show, I've got Jamie Brown over at the Daily Hotspur. Jay, how are you?
I'm very good, thank you, Ricky. And of course, Tottenham making it a nice time to be a Spurs fan at the moment. Obviously, a good start to the season. We had that nice win at Wolves. And obviously, today's show, really, really good one. Obviously, got one of the very top Spurs journalists on. So, really excited to speak to him. So, should be a good show.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, conscious obviously over the last, since the window is open, we've had some really, really good top-tier journalists join us on Last Word on Spurs. A lot of people have been asking us, when are we going to finally get Dan Kilpatrick on from the Standard? So I'm delighted to say we've actually finally made that happen. Dan, lovely to have you on Last Word on Spurs. Firstly, how are you? How's your summer been?
Well, thanks. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. My summer's been good. Quite hectic, as we've just been saying kind of off air. Just got a new baby, so I've been on paternity leave for some of it, and I missed kind of all Spurs signings, really. I missed Richarlison, I missed Basuma, I missed that kind of glut of early transfer business, which was a kind of blessing and a curse, I suppose, because you want to be in the thick of it in this job. You don't want to be missing things, but at the same time, it was quite nice just kind of sitting back, putting my feet up when I could, and kind of watching other people do all the hard work and try and get those stories.
Well, Dan, listen, it's an absolute pleasure to finally have you on Last Word on Spurs. And I'm conscious that I say there's so much right now around the transfer window. I think from us, like I say, in terms of this show, we maybe want to take, again, covering maybe aspects of where we are in the window, but also looking around Spurs in general as the club over the last year or so, which I know you've covered quite extensively, despite the fact you've managed to find a way to have paternity leave in there as well. So all the power to you. Listen, it has been a good solid start from Spurs this season. Obviously 7 points out of a possible 9. What have you made so far of the campaign, given the fact that Spurs already had obviously 6 signings come in and then subsequently a 7-1 that went back out on loan? Thoughts overall, Dan, for you?
So in terms of the start to the season, I think very positive. I mean, 7 more points than from the corresponding fixtures last season. Already kind of 5 points up on Liverpool, 4 on United. That's a nice position to be in. And I think it's a cliche, but at this stage of the season, it's really about results, not performances. I mean, if you look at kind of typically Guardiola City or Klopp's Liverpool, they don't tend to really get going until kind of October, even November. That's going to be a bit strange this season because then there's the break for the World Cup in mid-November. But the really good sides at this stage are just looking to get points on the board by hook or by crook, really, and then they're not kind of expected to be a full pelt. So I think the fact that Spurs have got 7 points, not necessarily played particularly well, is absolutely fine. And I think if I was to pick out one thing, it would be the kind of mentality aspect of all 3 performances. I think, Southampton coming from behind, to win very routinely. Chelsea, finding a way back twice, and then to kind of dig it out at Wolves and what was quite a tight game. All 3 matches that there were kind of signs of this new found sort of steel, determination and the kind of signs of a squad that are sort of finding a way to win when they're not at their best. So yeah, I think everyone can be really pleased with the first 3 games so far.
Yeah, you spoke there about the performances. Obviously, we saw the game at Stamford Bridge. It was far from the most ideal performance from Spurs. But what are you maybe slightly concerned about that performance, or do you think that maybe the result was the more important thing in terms of Spurs getting a point at Stamford Bridge? Were you worried about that result and performance at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, it is just really difficult to go to Stamford Bridge. I mean, and especially when you're Spurs and you've got this weight of history on top of you, and the record there is horrendous. But look, Chelsea will win most games at Stamford Bridge, or at least not lose most games. They're still, a top 3 side at home, and I think that was maybe missed in the aftermath when people were dissecting the performance. That actually, there just aren't many sides that are going to go there and come away with anything. So. I think it was a really good point. I do think there are aspects of the performance that was slightly concerning, particularly when you kind of marry that game together with the Wolves game as well. Because I think in both games, Spurs were just overrun a bit in midfield. There wasn't much control there. That they were kind of outpressed and sort of outplayed by greater numbers. Wolves had the 3, and Tuchel kind of doubled up quite cleverly with his wing backs, but everyone kind of shifted over to give them an extra man on the right. And I think both Wolves and Chelsea are sides that don't really have a finisher. Wolves obviously had Jimenez on the bench, but he hasn't quite been the same player since he came back. They had Guedes up front, and everyone knows that Chelsea don't really have a centre forward. So I was kind of looking at those games and thinking, if either of those sides had just a half decent or kind of lethal poacher up front, then Spurs could have been in a bit of trouble. So that is definitely something to look out for. And I think we'll maybe come on to this later, but you wonder whether Basuma or Skip or both might help give Spurs a bit more control in there, because I think that's something they've missed in the first 2 out of the 3 games anyway.
I mean, go on, Jay.
I was going to say, obviously, one thing that really impressed me at that Stamford Bridge game, although it wasn't the best performance, I thought the new signings coming off the bench were really impressive. And obviously, it's been a very busy transfer window for Spurs. 7 new players through the door, the likes of Basuma, Richarlison, Perisic, Longley, Jed Spence, Fraser Forster, and Destiny Udogie. I mean, what have you made of Spurs' transfer business so far? And of course, a week left. Maybe might there be more done? And what have you made of it so far?
Yeah, I think it's been really, really encouraging so far. I think it's just been a really kind of almost strangely competent window from Spurs. I mean, not least in the speed with which they did most of their business. They got all those signings. I think they got the majority, maybe 5 of them in for the start of pre-season, and Spence was sort of a week or 10 days after they'd gone back. So, really encouraging in that regard. They're all players, with the exception possibly of Spence, who have either Premier League experience or kind of top level European experience in the case of Longley and Perisic. So I think, it's for me, it's been a kind of 8 out of 10 window so far. And as you said, if they can get a couple more unwanted players out the door and maybe upgrade Hill and Tanganga in the last week, then it could easily be a kind of 9 out of 10 or 10 out of 10 window. I think it's been really encouraging, and just a kind of strange but positive break from the way Spurs have so often done things in kind of previous transfer windows.
I think, Dan, like you said, what's interesting there is the way Spurs moved so decisively in the early weeks of the window, something that we're not used to, really, if we're being honest, in the last 15, 20 years with Tottenham in the transfer market. And a lot of that is to deal with maybe what's happened behind the scenes at Tottenham in terms of the recruitment structure. If you want to give us a bit of detail on that, because I know you wrote extensively about that for The Standard. How much has that benefited the club in terms of what's happened behind the scenes in order to be able to get to Spurs where they are now in the window, where you'd imagine, got a number of their key targets already over the line and in the squad for Conte? Yeah,
well, I think Paratici's been massive and has been, increasingly looks like a very good appointment. I thought at this stage last season that the jury was very, very much out on him, not least because he had seemingly hired Nuno, and I wasn't particularly convinced about last summer's business as well. But I think that there's a perception among the fan base that kind of Conte is the one who has kind of pressured Daniel Levy or encouraged Daniel Levy to do business early. And, all his kind of public statements and sort of avert pressure on the chairman is the reason why Spurs have changed their transfer policy. But I think that's probably a bit of a misconception. Like, I think it's Paratici who, has Levy's ear and is the one who said, look, if we're serious, we've got to start behaving like, elite clubs. We've got to do what, for example, Juventus did or Man City do every year, where their business is pretty much already in place for the start of the pre-season. So I think he's increasingly influential. He's running the football side of the club. He's got a number of new hires in. I think Andy Spaulding's come from Rangers. The new chief scout, Gabbanini's come from Watford and Udinese, and Greta Steinson as well is kind of Paratici's deputy. So he's completely transforming the recruitment structure and kind of making Spurs operate like an elite club that that Daniel Levy wants them to be. There's not many elite clubs who just kind of rely on the chairman to do all the negotiations. They have several people kind of watching players and talking to clubs and agents and doing business. So I think that that's been a dramatic change. I don't think it's completely over yet. I think there's still kind of work Paratici's doing behind the scenes on the scouting department, recruitment department, analytics department, and he's trying to modernise Spurs. And at the moment, from what we're hearing, the signs are very positive.
I mean, you mentioned all that there in terms of the new people coming in. Does it really feel like Levy is now finally giving over control? Because I know a lot of Spurs fans obviously very critical in the past of Daniel Levy and maybe having too much control. But you finally feel like maybe he's giving over that control, given all the new stuff that's in place under Paratici.
I think so. Yeah. I mean, there's definitely a sense that Paratici has more power and more influence than Levy's previous directors of football. I mean, Levy has always been a big advocate of the kind of European model of having I say European model, I mean, it was considered the European model. Most clubs have it now. But he's always been a big advocate, and he's had Kamoli and Arneson and Baldini and David Pleat, But I think Paratici is just a more influential figure than any of them were, and he's got more power. He's running the football side of the club. That's not to say Levy's not still involved. He's been hands-on negotiating some of the transfers this summer. He's been involved in that, but it's not as if it's just a kind of one-man operation anymore. It's much more that he's part of a structure, and Paratici has a lot of control and influence and say in that structure.
It does feel like, Dan, for a first time in a long time, there's actually a plan. I mean, it seems like there's actually a blueprint now of what Spurs are trying to achieve, which is obviously great to see. Just in terms of maybe looking at what Spurs have done in the window, I mean, listen, they've brought in an array of different players for a number of different positions. Do you have a feeling still that there may be an opportunity still to strengthen given the time still left in the window? I mean, there's been reports that the club may look to act on a centre-back or potentially a creative-minded midfielder, depending on the outgoings. And we know Conte was very strong in his, I think it was post-match press conference, Dan, I think you was at, where he said that for him now, this squad is this, and if someone goes away, then another has to come in. This is to be clear for everybody. Now, we understand, obviously, we're going to ask you about Brian Hill, what you think about him, but in terms of other areas you think we'd like to strengthen, Dan, what's your thoughts on that?
Well, I think the situation now is really that if Hill and Tanganga go, which is pretty widely reported now, I think Valencia are trying to get Hill back on loan. He'd like to go play regular football, boost his chances of being in the Spain squad for the World Cup. And Tanganga, I think he's attracted interest from quite a few Italian clubs. I think he's got an Italian agent, and AC Milan and Nottingham Forest are kind of interested in signing him, but Spurs are trying to work out a deal that suits them. So I think the situation is, if those two go, Conte's made it clear they'll have to be replaced. I don't think he would need replacement for Winks and Reguilon, for example, because he's not considering them part of the squad anymore. They're training individually and at different times from the rest of the squad. And that's also true of Tanganga and Lo Celso, who have gone in the last kind of week or so. So yeah, I think if there's to be more business to be done, it's players to come in the positions of those two. So a centre half who could play in the back three, and a kind of creative wide forward who could play in one of the positions across the front and possibly be another option at wing back as well.
Yeah, of course. So you mentioned 7 new players through the door. In terms of Antonio Conte, do you think he'd be happy? Obviously, I know you spend a lot of time in the press conferences with him, and we heard a lot about him speaking about the new signings. Do you get the sense that he's quite happy with what's happened so far at Spurs?
Yeah, I think he seems really happy with it. He certainly stopped threatening to quit, which was obviously a theme of last season.
That's handy, that's quite handy. That.
Yeah. I think he seems pleased, and actually, he's obviously said he wants any members of the squad who leave to be replaced now, which again I think was a reference to Hill and Tanganga. But he's also kind of said, he's not pushing the club to spend big money on any new players. So I do get the impression that the big money deals are probably done. You never say never in the transfer window, because if Inter said, do you want Bastoni after all for 50 million or whatever, then I'm sure Spurs would consider it. But I get the impression that Conte is wary of doing too much too soon. He certainly kind of hinted at that a couple of press conferences ago, that he'd be, I think he said, I'd be crazy to demand the club spends big money on more players. So yeah, he's got 6 players who dramatically kind of improve the squad and improve his options. As you alluded to, it's already sort of paying dividends at Chelsea. But he probably doesn't want to be in a situation where he gets given 2 more big players on deadline day that he's then got to integrate into the squad in a kind of fairly limited amount of time, given the split in the season. So yeah, I think he's happy, but I would kind of, I suppose I would temper expectations as to sort of further business, but certainly if those 2 players go, then I think Spurs will be looking to do more.
And I just wanted to ask, there's still quite a lot of criticism flying around on social media. What a shock that is, obviously, given the nature of it. But me personally, I'm really happy with what we've done. But there's still some supporters that may be been a bit underwhelmed by what we've done. Obviously, we did get into the Champions League. Can you understand that at all? Because obviously, one of the big positions we were going to go for was a left-sided centre-back. Obviously, Longley, maybe some fans can be underwhelmed by that. But can you see that at all, that it's been an underwhelming transfer window for Spurs?
No, I don't share that view personally. There's always people that aren't happy on social media. I think you can find someone who thinks Kane's should be sold, or you could pretty much find any opinion on there. I suppose in terms of the back 3, I could possibly understand that, because I think people perhaps feel that Longley was an underwhelming addition. I think probably based on the fact that he's kind of a loanee, and also because he feels underwhelming compared to Bastoni, who was obviously the target at the start of the window. But I think he's someone with sort of top level European experience. Played for France. In a very, very competitive position for them. Had a couple of great seasons at Barcelona, and then lost confidence, started making mistakes, which wasn't a huge surprise given what was happening at Barcelona, I think. So I think he could prove to be a really kind of astute signing, and some good competition for Ben Davies. And the fact that he's a loanee maybe suggests that Spurs will review that position again next summer and see if they could get Bastoni or Guardiola or someone who was more of a long-term solution there. But no, to answer your question, I don't share the view that it's an underwhelming window, but perhaps I can kind of get where that perception comes from when it comes to the back 3.
Okay, Dan. Well, listen, I know Spurs, we've been linked with a numerous amount of different targets so far. And like I say, we've said that we're not going to make this a countdown drilling session over Spurs' summer transfer window. I mean, one of the areas that we have spoken about is that midfield area. Now, there is that argument where I sit on the fence where, for me personally, I still feel Tottenham, when they're coming up against teams that are going to deploy a low block 10 behind the ball, they're going to have to find a way of breaking the defence down. And obviously, Wolves at the weekend, I think you were there as well. It wasn't the most easiest game for Tottenham, in terms of navigating to get themselves a win. You could arguably say that would have been a game last season Spurs would have lost, and they obviously did lose last season. But you do just feel that, me personally, there's an expectation where there's meant to be creativity from the wing backs in terms of the way Conte deploys his system. Whereas my argument is it would be nice for Spurs to have that traditional maybe number 10 that can come off the bench, that can look to change a game. I mean, there's been loads of different names that have been mentioned. I'm sure you're aware, Dan, the likes of Maddison. We've got Ruslan Malasovsky in there as well. We've discussed that might be an area Spurs might look at. I mean, is there any names at the moment, Dan, that are worth bringing to the table as we are now, a week or so before the deadline, in your opinion?
I mean, I haven't got any new names for you. I think it's an interesting question, though, because I think, again, that there's a kind of perception that that's the kind of player Spurs need. But does Conte see it that way, or is he expecting the creativity to come from his wide forwards and wing backs, which has certainly been the way, he's played so far? I mean, I think there's only one game, apart from when he went with a back four against Chelsea when he was really short defenders. But there's only one game where he's deviated from the 3-4-3, and that was Liverpool, which was a weird game, the 2-2 draw. When he went with
Leicester as well. I think Leicester as well away was one when that 3-2 win. I think it was Winks, Skip, and Højbjerg in the midfield.
Oh, really? Okay. Yeah. Yeah, but I mean, I think that both those situations, probably fair to say, were kind of a case of needs must rather than a sort of tactical plan. So he doesn't really want to deviate from the 3-4-3. In which case you kind of wonder where the creative player would kind of fit in, unless it was just an option from the bench, as you said, Ricky. I mean, I did wonder about Eriksen. I think it's ancient history now, but Conte had worked with him before. He would have been a really interesting option, I think, for Spurs. He's obviously now playing in a 2 for Ten Hag's United as well. So he was one that I definitely think was I'm certain was kind of considered. I'm not sure how far that got. So perhaps in the last week, one of these names will kind of come into prominence. But the way I see it, Conte is kind of more focused on getting the right players at wing back and in wide forward, because I think that's where he sees his teams sort of breaking down stubborn sides, in those wide areas.
And before I pass back over to Jamie, Dan, I mean, just getting your thoughts on this. I mean, if Conte really did want that creative-minded midfielder, surely we're not in that situation where, given how early Spurs did a lot of their business, surely if it's such a demand of Conte, wouldn't be waiting until the last 8-9 days of a window.
Exactly.
70, 80 million on a player that's arguably going to be sitting on the bench, if you see where I'm coming from.
Yeah, exactly that. I mean, if he really wanted that type of player, I think Spurs would have signed that type of player already. Again, if Hill goes to Valencia, Spurs want a replacement lined up, and it would be interesting to see, who that was and what type of player they were. Could it, for instance, be a player who could play as a wide forward, but was capable of kind of dropping back to number 10? I mean, the other thing to say is I think Kulusevski did an interview quite recently where he said his favourite position was number 10, and that's where he felt he was best. You can make a pretty strong case that Kane is a kind of half 9, half 10. I think Conte has spoken at kind of great length about wanting to improve Skip on the ball and make him better in the final third. Basuma, is more than capable of getting up the pitch. I think probably more so than Højbjerg. So again, there are players in the squad that will be able to do the role that we're talking about. So, do Spurs need to go out and buy a specialist who wouldn't start in the current system? I don't know.
I mean, the other thing I will say just for me, Dan, is by doing Last Word on Spurs twice a week, post-match and pre-match games, the thoughts of having to keep trying to pronounce Ruslan Malinowski and trying to get that right every single show is going to be a real battle for me. So,
I mean, that's why I didn't try.
I love how you let me do that.
I mean, on the script, it's actually one of my questions. So, Ricky, you've done very well to steal it. And that means I don't have to ask it. I'm very grateful for that. But yeah, Dan, I think Brian Hill, it does look like he is going to go to Valencia. And as we mentioned, Conte has said that he wants to replace players. So do you think that we are going to see another forward coming in? Do you think a player like an Adama Traore or maybe a Wilfried Zaha, is that kind of the player that Spurs might look to? And what are your kind of thoughts on Adama Traore? I know he's still being linked with Spurs, obviously, by a couple of reports. What would you make of Adama or a player of that ilk coming to Spurs?
Well, first of all, I don't think Zaha's going to happen. I mean, Palace would surely want about 100 million to sell him. I don't see that one happening at all. I mean, first of all, on Hill, I think it's a kind of interesting situation because I think Conte's obviously said he doesn't think he is completely suitable for the Premier League, but I think Conte's also kind of conscious that he is a pretty talented player. He's played for Spain. He was very highly thought of when he came to Spurs, and I think that there's a kind of acceptance that he's actually not a bad kind of fourth or fifth or sixth forward to have in there. That Spurs could do much worse than having him as that kind of final forward option. So there's an acceptance, I think, that to let him go on loan and not get any money, but continue his development, that they would then have to find someone who was better than a kind of decent Spain international, and who also was willing to kind of compete with Kane and so on, and Kulusevski and Richarlison and Lucas, which is not easy. So it's a tricky one. Adama, I definitely think is a one worth keeping an eye on, obviously because of his contract situation at Wolves. That they're going to want to sell. Paratici obviously likes him. Personally, I'm not totally convinced. I mean, he's already kind of turned down Spurs once. I'm would be more interested in seeing what Conte could do with him as a wing back on the right side. But Spencer's already come in. Doesn't look like Doherty and Emerson are kind of going anywhere. So you would just end up kind of overloaded in that position if Adama comes in to play there. And I'm personally, just not convinced of him as a forward. That said, it would just be fascinating to see what Conte could do with him. He's such a great coach, and there clearly are some really exciting raw materials there. I think worth keeping an eye on Adama. I don't have any searing transfer exclusives for you, but I mean, he's obviously a player that Spurs have looked at in the past, is well regarded, and potentially could be a decent direct replacement for Hill.
I thought that was quite interesting, actually. I was going to ask about whether you thought Adama Traore could come in and play in that right wing-back role. We've seen I think it was a recent interview, I think it might have been with BT Sport, and I think Spurs put it on their channels as well, about Conte was explaining how the wing-backs work, and he said he likes to use wing-backs that have been wingers. So I think Adama could be quite interesting as a wing-back. But just to bring quickly back on Brian Hill, of course, another loan move for him. Do you think there's any chance that this is a player that might make it at Spurs, or do you think he's a guy that just doesn't seem to fit into a Antonio Conte system?
Yeah, I mean, probably the latter, unfortunately. I mean, again, Conte was pretty clear that he just doesn't see him as a kind of Premier League player, or just doesn't think he's quite got the physicality, I guess, to play in his team in the Premier League. That's not to say he couldn't necessarily play for someone else in English football, But clearly, he's a good player. I don't think it's quite going to work for Spurs. It strikes me that he was a signing, a kind of early Paratici signing that perhaps Paratici wouldn't make now. Now that he's got a bit more expertise around him of the English market, and now that he's got Conte as manager, I think that was a deal designed to get a young prospect in and get Lamela off the books as well. That maybe seemed quite smart, but in hindsight, Spurs just hadn't quite done their due diligence on whether he would be suitable for for this country. But I think he's probably going to go back to Spain and be very, very good. Have a very good career there. But just one of those players that just doesn't seem right for English football.
Okay, no problem at all. Dan, I was going to go straight to our defenders, but only because it's been coming up in the comments and there's been a few links to him today. Just another winger, if you don't mind me asking you about, is Dan James. Only because we were on the subject of talking about Adama Traore. And I mean, again, it's another name in potentially a list that has been speculated upon. Is that one that is of a credible name you could see coming to Spurs as things stand at the moment in the window?
I mean, I don't know about that. I saw my esteemed colleague, the great Alistair Gold, had said that he was a player that Paratici liked. I haven't personally heard that. I think as Ali outlined in his piece on it, it would strike me as a really strange signing just because he's not homegrown. He wouldn't necessarily play more for Spurs than he would for Leeds. And I don't think he's a particularly good player either. That's just my personal view. So I'll be pretty surprised. I mean, one thing I will say is that there'll be at this stage of the window there are just a lot of clubs and agents offering players around. That's natural, and Spurs will probably be looking at a lot of players, offered a lot of players. And that doesn't necessarily mean a bid's going to go in imminently or anything like that. So it may just be that Dan James is one of the many players who is again a potential for that 5th or 6th striker spot should Hill go.
Just to also get your thoughts, Dan. Again, we'll come on to defenders in a second, but someone like Anthony Gordon, I'm not asking you to speculate maybe over a move to Tottenham, but the financial price on that guy's head at the moment, which we understand to be in the region of £60 million. I mean, probably that's the value of what it is for Everton in order what it would be to lose him for their squad of 60 million. But can you quite work out that figure on Anthony Gordon's head? Seems like, again, talented player, lots of potential, but based on his stats, which I saw earlier today, I think, is it 4 goals, 3 assists, around a total of 60 appearances in total for Everton. Can you understand that potential?
Well, no, I mean, he by the way, he was a player Spurs were definitely interested in. I think probably still are keeping an eye on the situation for sure. And I think, again, he was someone that Spurs and Chelsea, potentially think could play as wing back or a forward. But I think the feeling from Spurs earlier in the window, when they were talking to Everton about Richarlison, was that Everton would want silly money for him, and also that they were very, very reluctant to lose him because of the sort of message that would send to their fan base, which would again just add to his price. So Spurs cool on that deal. It looks like Chelsea are probably going to go for it at 60 million. Yeah, I think it's a massive price. They're going to overpay for him, that's for sure. They've probably overpaid for Cucurella as well. I suppose a player's only kind of worth what someone's willing to pay for him. So, it may prove to be an inspired bit of business for them if he really comes good. But yeah, I mean, certainly when you consider that they're sending Hudson-Odoi on loan to Germany this week, it seems a pretty strange bit of business. And you do wonder whether they could have just kept their powder dry on that one and spent that money better in future.
Okay, let's turn our attention to the defenders and where we're at now. So we knew of a quartet that Conte simply signed off and said, he doesn't see a future for him at Tottenham. Of course, that was Tanguy Ndombele, Giovanni Lo Celso that have now respectively got moves elsewhere. Obviously, Ndombele joining Napoli on loan for the rest of the season. I think with a view to a purchase there. We've got obviously Giovanni Lo Celso, who has joined Villarreal with an option, as I understand, in January. Whereas if the player deems another move sufficient and Spurs, he can go ahead and take that move. On those two, Dan, let's actually start. What have you made of Ndombele and Lo Celso's departures? And how disappointed are you? Because I know, again, colleague of yours, Charlie Eccleshare, did a poll, I think a couple of weeks ago, saying who has been the most, I'll try and put it the most politest way possible, the most underwhelming signing out of the two. Just how disappointed, Dan? Because I think I remember seeing you being very excited when Ndombele was announced and Lo Celso. So how upsetting is it for you, maybe taking the journalist hat off and the fan hat on, that neither of them really have been a success at Tottenham?
Yeah, well, I mean, it was disappointing. I was definitely an Ndom believer, and obviously I thought Lo Celso looked really promising for a kind of short period under Mourinho, and was kind of hopeful that he would fulfil his kind of obvious talent and potential at Spurs as well. They've just tanked, haven't they? Both of them in a big way. I think an interesting sort of counterfactual where they're concerned is, would it have been any better if Pochettino had stayed in the job? I think Pochettino obviously kind of quite wanted Lo Celso as his fellow Argentine, and Ndombele was kind of obviously signed for him as well. So that they were, their lives were made harder by the fact their manager they were signed for was sacked a few months after they joined, definitely. But yeah, I mean, I think everything that has been said about them is kind of already been said. Massive flops. The danger is we just end up in the same situation a year from now, and they're back at Spurs or, going on another loan. I think, the club is hoping, in the case of Lo Celso, as you said, that he has a good half season for Villarreal again, impresses at the World Cup for Argentina, and then in a potentially kind of more buoyant European market at the start of next year, there's a bit more competition for him, and they can perhaps get a bidding war going and recoup something closer to what they paid for him. Again, and Ndombele, the hope there is that he goes to Napoli, slower pace league, but they're in the Champions League, and can just kind of show what he can do, and that either Napoli take up their option or next summer there's more interest in him. He obviously didn't do much back on loan at Lyon to kind of drum up interest this summer. But yeah, I mean, I thought actually on paper, people will hammer me for this, but I actually maintain that they were kind of quite smart signings. I mean, Ndombele, I still think is one of the few players that could have genuinely replaced Dembele. He's so press resistant; he can do that job in there. But I mean, again, I mentioned earlier with Hill, had Spurs not quite done their due diligence, you do just wonder whether maybe had they looked less at the kind of last couple of seasons of form from Lo Celso and Ndombele and looked deeply at their kind of characters and style of play, they might have concluded that they weren't kind of great fits. But yeah, just got to hope we're not talking about this a year from now, I think.
Absolutely. Dan, it kind of led me on to the point where we're discussing in terms of outgoings of Tottenham. Obviously, Reguilon was one of the four of that quartet. We're obviously going to ask you about Harry Winks as well. But Reguilon, what I will ask you, Dan, is are you surprised, given the fact that when Conte came in, I think there was going to be a real big clamour thinking, this guy, he's a wing-back, Conte's going to get the best out of him, he's got pace, he lacks maybe an end product that I think we all probably agree with. Are you surprised that it simply hasn't worked out and he has favoured Sessegnon? Because again, I know many Spurs fans are of the opinion they're also doubtful whether Sessegnon has got the ability to really deliver that end product and are now championing Perisic to start in a majority of games. How do you see the way in which that's worked out in terms of that left-hand side of Spurs' defence?
Yeah, I'm not hugely surprised. I mean, what Conte wants from his wing backs is for them to be scoring and assisting a lot. He wants them in the final third, crossing for each other to score, ideally. That's what he loves. And I think when it happened for the first time last season, when kind of Sessegnon crossed for Doherty at Wolves, that felt like a significant moment for Conte, because that's exactly what he wants. And actually, if you look at Reguilon's history, he's never played wing back before last season. He doesn't score many goals. He's assisted a few. He had a spell of putting in quite nice kind of deep crosses under Mourinho for a while. But he's definitely not a kind of killer in the final third. And the amount of times that Kane sort of put the ball on a plate for him last season and he missed one-on-ones, he must have really frustrated Conte. Whereas actually Sessegnon has a very, very good record of being a goal scorer. He's got a season at Fulham, as a teenager, where he scored, I think, 17 goals, something like that. So he knows where the net is. He scored in his Spurs debut against Bayern Munich, and he's lost confidence and particularly in his own body, I think, over the last kind of couple of years with all the hamstring injuries. But I think Conte has seen in him that he is a player that can be a wing back in his team. He has that instinct for goal that Conte wants, and I think once he builds himself up physically and trusts his body a bit more, he's kind of got the engine and the sort of physicality that Conte wants as well. So I think I'm not hugely surprised. I think if needs must, and I think Reguilon is a player who could do a job and has done a job in that position. I don't think he's a kind of big liability or anything, but the first thing kind of Conte wanted to do last season, once his side was up and running, was upgrade the wing backs, and he's obviously done that with Perisic. The right side is still a bit of a question mark, but I'm not sort of that surprised that he's binned off Reggie.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting about Ryan Sessegnon. I totally agree that it's just confidence. I mean, we've seen he can, score those goals, as you said. I mean, remember him back to that time at Fulham when he had that fantastic year in the Championship, scoring so many goals. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with Sessegnon. But another player that looks like he might leave the club is Japhet Tanganga's reported interest from AC Milan, and then of course Nottingham Forest, I think, crept up yesterday as well. Do you think he's a player that might leave Spurs, and is there a future at all for him at Spurs? Because he's not really kicked on, has he, at Spurs? We obviously had that fantastic debut against Liverpool, but not really quite happened for him at Spurs, Japhet Tanganga.
No, it's not really. I think he's been pretty unlucky with injuries. He's got quite a few at kind of the wrong time as well. I mean, I think he's a good player. He's quite versatile, aggressive, has some really strong attributes, but I don't think long term he's kind of good enough for where Spurs want to be going, and I think that's kind of been recognised. Obviously, he's come through the academy, so to get a loan deal with an option of, I think, 20 million's being spoken about. I've read that today. Would obviously be a really, really good bit of business for Spurs, and I think a good move for him as well. I think he's more than capable of being a kind of Premier League or possibly Serie A regular somewhere else. But yeah, I definitely think he's someone who Spurs are kind of looking to move on in the next week, and then as we've said, if that happens, they'll get someone else in.
I'm interested to ask you, Dan, about some of the midfield options and a player that you've wrote about recently, Pierre-Emile Højbjerg. As you all know, fellow Spurs reporters amongst you, and as we know doing the pod as well, it's interesting with Højbjerg. I would say amongst fellow Spurs fans, and again, many different guests we have on Last Word on Spurs, that he really does polarise opinion. Some, in my case, feel he's a midfield general, he's a lieutenant to Conte, so important as a leader of that dressing room. There's others that just can't see long-term what he can provide to the club that we can't get maybe elsewhere. I'm really intrigued. I know you wrote a piece recently. Where do you sit on Pierre-Emile Højbjerg? And we've seen, supposed interest from Real Madrid in the player. To Tell us your thoughts on Pierre Højbjerg and whether you feel he has got a long-term future at Tottenham.
Yeah, I mean, my view is that I think he's been underappreciated and is underappreciated. I think, part of that probably stems from the fact that he's probably played too much over the last couple of years. And that's largely because Spurs just haven't had anyone else in there. I mean, he was competing, for a while with kind of a declining Sissoko and a Winks who's been out of favour for a while now. And he hasn't really had any competition in there until this season, really. I think he also has a habit of kind of wanting to play every minute, a bit like Kane, and that's sometimes, to his detriment because he's played with knocks and perhaps when he needs a rest, and that's when he's kind of underperformed. So I think he is underappreciated, but at the same time, I'm kind of intrigued to see what happens when he's not in the team, and when perhaps Basuma's in there next to Bentancur, or just any two of Skip, Bentancur, and Basuma. I'm interested to see whether Spurs really miss him, whether they can have more control in midfield than they did in the games against Chelsea and Wolves, whether they're a bit more press resistant, whether they progress the ball a bit better, because I think that has been a weakness, and I think it's pretty clear that Højbjerg is kind of not not a particularly kind of creative option in the opposition half. I think he can be quite ponderous on the ball, and he's not kind of got that ability that Skip has, and I think Bentancur has, to just kind of move the ball on with both feet, kind of very, very quickly and efficiently and impressively. Yeah, but he obviously brings other things to the table. Including a lot of intangibles. He's very, very serious guy, very sort of professional guy, and I think he kind of sets a lot of standards around the team and the dressing room, and raises standards as well. And I think in that regard, he's kind of quite similar to Conte in his outlook and approach, and definitely kind of. I think one of you just said it. He one of Conte's kind of generals. But yeah, I think key player for Spurs, definitely got a future. But I'm interested to see what happens without him in the team. And the piece I wrote for the Standard this week basically outlined those points and said, we might really only get an idea of how valuable he is when he's not in the team anymore. If Spurs look much better, with a more kind of progressive option in there, then we might start thinking, that they've progressed a bit beyond Højbjerg. But just as easily, I think we could be saying, hold on, we're really missing the kind of intangibles, the work rate, the kind of dirty stuff he does in the middle of the park, and that's gone now, and we kind of didn't know what we had until we haven't got it.
You mentioned there about how many games he has played, and I think I saw a stat this morning that no outfield player since he arrived at the club, or in terms of the whole Premier League, has played more minutes than him. So it shows you. I think that's something that's so underrated about him is his availability. I think to always be there for Conte. He's missed just 2 games since he's arrived at the club, which I think is really important. I think that was a big thing about Christian Eriksen that I remember. Although he had maybe games where he was, dipping in and out of form, he was always available. So I think that's such a big thing for Højbjerg. He's always available, as I said. But just on, the midfield options, you've got 4 really quality players there now. Bentancur, Skip, Højbjerg, and then Basuma, of course, that's the other one. Maybe, eventually, who do you kind of see as being Conte's best pairing? Obviously now, it seems to be Bentancur and Højbjerg at the moment, but kind of long term, when everything's fully going, who do you kind of anticipate will be that tool maybe you'd like to see?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question, and I really don't know the answer. I personally really am intrigued to see a Skip Basuma pairing. I really like Skip. I think he's got a really high ceiling to be a kind of proper box-to-box top midfielder. He's got sort of both feet. He can pass the ball. He does the dirty work as well. He was singled out by Mourinho, if I recall rightly, for his kind of leadership qualities, despite being very young. And I haven't seen a huge amount of Basuma, but I remember definitely 2 out of the 3 times Spurs played Brighton last season, he just ran the game and was brilliant. So I'm really excited to kind of see more of him and start seeing him every week. I think, he'll be a bit more of a dynamic option, certainly than kind of Højbjerg. So I'll be intrigued to see those two. But I mean, Bentancur has been just a great signing and probably would have got more praise if he hadn't come in a kind of pair with Kulusevski. He's just been outstanding as well. And then obviously, as I said, Højbjerg is, I think, undervalued. So 4 good options there. If I had to kind of, bet the house on it, I could see Conte going with Basuma and Højbjerg in kind of big games when Spurs are really up to speed. At least starting with those 2. But I think at the moment he likes Skip, and it's anyone's guess, isn't it?
It's just impossible. I've been just thinking about it off the top of my head. I literally cannot think. Kind of everyone brings real quality to that team and maybe something different. So I think it's going to be really interesting to kind of see how that midfield pairing gets on. But just in terms of 2 players who maybe are not going to benefit from 4 options in midfield is Papamata Sarr and Harry Winks. Are those 2 players that maybe you expect to leave the club? And what's the latest on those 2 players?
Yeah, I mean, Winks is obviously not in Conte's plans nor training with the squad. I expect he will leave in the last week. I think that there was an anticipation from sort of his camp a few weeks ago that it was going to go down to the last kind of week, 10 days, which I guess we're in now. It could easily be a kind of deadline deal. Spurs will, I guess, get soften their position in terms of asking price and what they're prepared to do, which will perhaps interest a lot of Premier League clubs. In the last few days, they'll be kind of hoping to get a bargain from Spurs. I also think I could see him going to Spain. There's English players just seem more open to going overseas now, which is kind of a good thing. Yeah, I think he has some Spanish heritage, and he just is a type of player that would suit La Liga. He plays in that way, and I think there'd be lots of Spanish clubs who would quite like the idea of maybe getting him on loan for a year and seeing what he could do. As for Sarr, I just don't know a huge amount about Sarr, because I didn't really watch Mets last season. So again, kind of someone I'm interested in seeing. I think the feeling at the start of the summer was very much that he would probably go out on another loan and most likely, this time to an English club or either a kind of bigger European club. I think Mets were fighting relegation last year, so I suppose they'd probably want him in a sort of higher level team if they did send him out. He's gonna, I guess, struggle to get much game time. Harvey White is another player who I guess is kind of competing with him to be the 5th or 6th choice in there. So it could come down to who's got the best, which options present themselves to those 2 players, and kind of which Spurs think is the best one to keep around and which they think is the best to send out.
What's Dan, very interesting. I want to ask you on it quickly. I think lots of fans just seem to expect that, when we bring a player in that needs a loan, why can he not get a Premier League loan? Why can he not get an English loan? I think, the likes of Hill, Sarr, we've seen down the years with Tottenham, they've signed these prospects and there's an expectation why they can't get an English loan. Is that, again, Dan, in both camps, one that if they go back to a country that they really know well, they will perform. Therefore, if there isn't a spot for them at Tottenham, you're going to most likely extract a decent sized fee, and at the same time there just might not be that perceived interest in England. Is that what maybe is the struggles of trying to find the right loan for the respective players?
Yeah, I think so. You obviously, when you send someone out, you're really hoping they're going to play every week, and that's the kind of main factor. I think you just don't want to be sending someone on loan who's then not going to make an impression and barely play. I mean, I think Hill is kind of interesting, isn't it? Because if he's not suited to the Premier League, then you would say he's not going to get suited to the Premier League by going back to Valencia. So I kind of get that argument completely. Yep. Similarly with Sarr, if he's going to be someone who Conte is going to kind of potentially use next year, then you want him, maybe getting to grips with this country and getting to grips with this league. So yeah, I get those arguments, but I think the most kind of important thing is to find a club where they're just going to keep getting minutes, because that's the main reason you want someone out on loan. To sort of in their cases to continue their development, and in the case of Lo Celso and Ndombele, be in the shop window.
Just to ask you about a player that was on loan last season, subsequently has now moved to Spurs, Jed Spence. So far, obviously, is yet to feature in a Spurs shirt, left out of the last two squads, which Antonio Conte has selected. I just wonder, from your perspective, what we play into that, or whether it's just a case that behind the scenes, Spence needs to earn Conte's trust and show that he can play the Conte way, really, got to say, build into that methodology Conte is trying to create. Is there an apprehension or maybe concern that he's not quite ready this season for Conte? What do you think?
Yeah, I think he's a really interesting case. I mean, obviously, Conte went on record kind of describing him as a club signing, which I think was quite pointed. I mean, I don't think Spurs would have signed him if Conte had said, "I absolutely don't want this guy." It's not a case of that, but it's clearly a case that this is someone who the club has said, we want to invest in as a player for the future. This is part of our transfer strategy, signing the best young players from the Football League, and we want you to work with him. And Conte said, okay. But yeah, as you said, it's clearly a case of him having to kind of get up to speed with the Conte way and the Premier League, and kind of earn his place, which I think he's more than capable of doing, by the way. But I guess, if there's a warning, Jack Clark was signed for Pochettino. I always remember going to one of the first press conferences after Jack Clark had signed, and someone asking Pochettino about him, and he kind of couldn't have been less keen to talk about it. He just wasn't his signing, and he made that clear from the start. Similarly, I think Mourinho was never kind of disparaging of Joe Rodon, but kind of always made it clear that he wanted a kind of experienced centre half. I remember, I think Rodon played at Chelsea shortly after Silva had signed, and then Mourinho basically came out and said, "Look, they've signed Thiago Silva, and the club has signed me, Joe Rodon," and so that never felt like a kind of happy relationship either. And obviously, those two, have ended up leaving the club, having barely played in the first team. So I guess that is the danger with Spence, that if you sign players for the manager that they're not, they didn't desperately want, it can end up that way. But I do think Spence is more than capable of kind of forcing his way into Conte's thinking, particularly because I think he plays in a position that, for me, is still a kind of weak link in the side. I don't think Reguilon, as kind of cool a guy as he is, Emerson Royale, as cool a guy as he is kind of the answer there. And I'm not totally convinced by Doherty either. So I think he's an interesting case, definitely one to keep an eye on. I know you guys were saying before we started recording that perhaps he could go out on loan. I'd be surprised if that, but if he's still struggling to get in the squad, then obviously he's going to be wanting to do that as soon as the January transfer window opens. That's for sure.
I was just going to ask a follow-up on the right wing-back spot, because I think for me that is a bit of a concern in terms of the options that we do have. And I think you mentioned earlier in the show, if we don't have that creative midfielder, we're obviously looking for creativity to come from elsewhere. And for me, that probably needs to come from the wing-back. So is that a real concern for you, that right wing-back spot, that maybe we don't have that option to really provide that creativity? Because on the left, we've seen that what the difference Ivan Perisic has made. Obviously made a great start to his Spurs career. So are you concerned at all about the right wing-back spot?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say I'm concerned, but I mean, I do think, as I just said, it's still the most obvious area of the squad that could be upgraded, and a lot depends on whether Spence, will be of the required level, right? But I think Royale against Wolves, put in a fairly typical performance. He saw a lot of the ball, but you just never really felt like he was going to be the one to make the breakthrough in the final third. He's kind of quite good at winning the odd corner and free kick, but I don't think he's throw in rather. But I don't think he's kind of great at getting it to far post, getting goals, and kind of putting in the kind of ball that Conte wants from his wing backs. Doherty, I think, had a really good spell, but it was quite a brief spell before he got injured last year, where the penny seemed to drop, and I think perhaps people have set a bit too much store on that little run of games. Before that, I thought he was pretty average. So he's got to kind of prove that wasn't just a sort of flash in the pan, and then we're kind of back to whether Spence is going to do enough to get in the side and impress Conte. I definitely think it's an area where where Spurs could upgrade, but there's probably just about enough there. If Doherty comes good, if Spence comes good, Royale's reliable in most games, so I think there's just about enough there to kind of not warrant panicking over it or trying to buy another wing back in the last week.
Yes, obviously, as you said, we've got a week left in the transfer window. Kind of, what are your feelings on how many more players might come through the door at Spurs? We mentioned there might be maybe a forward come through, a central defender. What kind of your feelings on maybe what Spurs need and how many you expect to come through?
Yeah, I think probably the maximum is going to be 2, and as we've said, it would be to replace Hill and Tanganga. You're potentially looking at a new forward and a new centre half. I would be surprised if it was kind of much beyond that, and it may end up only being one because only one of them goes. So I think most of the business was done early, which was a good thing, and I think that the priority in the last kind of week or so will be probably finding a new club for Winks and Reguilon, and perhaps sorting loans for players that need loans. But look, Conte's on the record, he's been very clear that he's happy with the squad size he's got, and so he's not going to tolerate kind of players leaving without others coming in. So I still think there's there's work to do on incomings as well.
Dan, leaving us on a cliffhanger. Dan, it's been a real pleasure having you on Last Word on Spurs. Thank you so much for your time. It's been insightful. Like I say, we've covered a variety of different topics, from the recruitment to Højbjerg, giving some more appreciation to him, and in terms of what's left of the window. Dan, where can we find all the latest coverage from you on Spurs? I say, if anyone doesn't know where to find you, I can't believe they don't, but where can they find all the latest work you provide on Tottenham?
Well, I'm on Twitter, Dan_KP. And obviously you can if you're in London, pick up the Evening Standard. It's free, so no reason not to.
Love it. Dan, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. And Jay, I'm sure you agree. Great interview and great to get the latest on Spurs. Where can we find, Jay, all the stuff you provide on Tottenham?
Yeah, obviously my Twitter handle's there. But no, I think really interesting show today. Of course, we do these transfer shows. Usually we're grilling the journalists, asking, when's this player's going to come through the door. But look, we've done most of our business and done some really good stuff. So it was nice to have kind of a more of a relaxed chat. So I really enjoyed today's show.
Absolutely. Listen, guys, thank you so much for your support. We know had a good 700, 800 of you watching us here live. So really appreciate all your support for Last Word on Spurs. From Jamie, from Dan, thank you so much for your support. We'll be back with you very soon. And as always,